Also saw a lot of violence in the house. My father was physical. The very first memory I actually ever have of my father throwing liquor glasses and my mom dodging them, and I can hear them shattering on the cabinets. And for my 7th birthday, my father gave me a Coors Light and a Marlboro Light there in the restaurant. So that was really my very first experience with anything, putting a substance in my body, at that early age on my 7th birthday. That he was also living a homosexual lifestyle with his partner, and that's the same partner that he had taken off with and lived for many decades.
I begin to ponder, where did I first begin to start living a double life? Because so many people aren't even thinking about that literally that's what they've been doing.
But that was really the pattern that started just this search for, why does nobody love me? Why does nobody want me? Why do I have this pain and this rejection? Why am I scared of everyone and everything? I went to go see my drug dealer. I got some pain pills. Those had been laced with fentanyl. I overdosed, I flatlined, and I was brought back just as I was getting out of an ambulance to head into the hospital.
I mean, women would not experience the same thing. No one's going around high-fiving women for sleeping with tons of men. But for some reason, from kind of a worldly dude's perspective, that's, supposedly cool or whatever. But
I had a real genuine belief, faith, prayer sitting on that bed at 1 p.m. that first day. And I just genuinely sort of poured out and said, God, I don't know how I got here, and I don't know what to do. Help me. And when I said amen, it felt like somebody wrapped their arms around me.
Welcome to the Love and Truth Network podcast, your guide for hope and healing in a hurting world searching for truth. Here we explore God's extraordinary design for biblical sexuality, identity, and authentic community. You'll be impacted by incredible stories of transformation, practical wisdom from pastors and counselors, and the power of God's grace that changes lives.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. We're really grateful that you're here today. And, when I was traveling over the summer with my family, we had a lot of stops at different churches around the Northeast. And our very last stop before heading back to Arizona was in Maryland, and at my dear friends who are there, who run Harvest Church, and really appreciate them, Frida as well as Justin, and had a great time actually doing a podcast with Justin recently. But while I was there, Justin and another gentleman, Jonathan, had pulled together a number of pastors in the area around their church. And Tony was actually one of the pastors. He's with us today, who joined for kind of an informational time, a Q&A time, a little bit of me sharing some of my story. And when Tony was sharing his story with me, I just felt like, man, I would love for you to join us for our podcast. There's so much here in your testimony. And so we're actually intending today for this to be a two-parter. Sometimes we wind up with a two-parter that just kind of happens because we keep talking for so long and there's so much good content. But Tony and I were talking a little bit and just thought, no, we're going to intentionally do these podcasts in two parts. So we're going to have Tony share his story with us. I'll do some Q&A around that story and that kind of thing. But then we're going to jump in from more of a kind of pastoral perspective. Tony is also a pastor, and kind of talk about, again, cultural issues, hot topic issues that we talk about all the time around sexuality and relationships and identity. But this first one, we want to really give some time and space for him to share his story in depth with us. So Tony, thanks so much for joining us for this episode.
Yeah, absolutely, Gary. Thank you. It is really a privilege and an honor to be here with you today.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we feel the same way. So if you would just begin sharing your story of how God intersected your life and what that looked like. I know it was a pretty bumpy road, to say the least. So buckle up, everybody, because it's a powerful story of God's mercy and grace.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Yeah, so I'm, like you mentioned there, you met me here in Frederick, Maryland. And so, my story of how God began to redeem my life took place here in Frederick. I'm originally from Baltimore, Maryland. And so I was born and I was raised there. There was a lot of trauma and brokenness in multiple ways, really early on from the onset of my life and my experience, even as a very young boy. Ultimately, though, let me give you a little bit of the why I came to Frederick, and then I'll back up a little bit. So I came to Frederick from Baltimore in 2019 by way of a Christ-centered recovery program. At the time, I was struggling with substances. At the time, I was also me and my wife had separated, and so really that was the place where God intersected. He truly called. I heard that call. I recognized that call, and so many things happened. But it took a lot to get to that point. So I share this with a lot of rawness and sort of full disclosure. But there's so many just major things that happened so early on. So one of the things that is important for me to share is, like we talk about in recovery, what is your very first memory or interaction with a substance? And so for me, I remember it was my 7th birthday. And of course, this is in the 90s when you could do more things in a restaurant. We were in a smoking section. If you remember, there was smoking and non-smoking and everything.
Yes.
Right. Often when I'm telling some other people that, they said, yeah, there was even smoking on planes then,
Yeah, I remember way back in the day that was still, I can't even believe it. But
right.
yes.
Yeah, it seems like a completely foreign, made-up concept at this point in 2025. But yeah, so I was in a smoking section. I was with my father. At this time, I was 7 years old, celebrating my 7th birthday. My parents had been divorced for a few years at that point, and my father had custody, mostly due to financial reasons. So my mother just wasn't in a place at that time to be able to take care of us. And my very first experience here was I was in this restaurant smoking section, and for my 7th birthday, my father gave me a Coors Light and a Marlboro Light there in the restaurant. So that was really my very first experience with anything, putting a substance in my body, at that early age on my 7th birthday. That sort of gives way to the toxicity that was a big part of my father and his interaction. It would be a year later from that would be the last time I ever saw or heard from my biological father. He lived a lifestyle where he was involved in all sorts of the wrong things. He was struggling with addiction himself, with drugs and alcohol. He was also criminally involved. He was an accountant, and he had several times been caught embezzling and stealing and transferring and doing all these sort of things. It was really interesting. It was about a 2.5 year span. I remember as a young kid living with my father, with my older 2 sisters. And it was such a strange lifestyle. We always grew up before that and after that, really not with much. We didn't have a whole lot of means, very much a low class, socioeconomic sort of upbringing. But for that little window of time, it was like my father gave us anything and everything we wanted. It was so strange. I remember as a 2nd grader being sent home from school because I had too much expensive jewelry on. And the teachers were, the teachers and administrators were worried about, liability, it was just such an interesting, and just so much going on within that short time period. But my father had a lot of struggles, and as a young adult and as a teenager growing up, having witnessed all these things, what I came to realize that it felt like was rejection. My father had struggled with all these things. As a result of that, he made the decision to run. I actually hadn't heard anything up until a couple years ago, where we found out as a family that he had died of some sort of heart issue right on the border in El Paso. His partner found him there. There's also woven in that story within divorce with my parents, and the story when my father left and went on the run, that he was also living a homosexual lifestyle with his partner, and that's the same partner that he had taken off with and lived for many decades in, I assume, El Paso. So there was a lot of struggles as the only boy in the family, having seen these things, having experienced these things, having that experience on my 7th birthday. I also saw a lot of violence in the house. My father was physical. The very first memory I actually ever have is I'm sitting on the couch in our house in Baltimore, and there was sort of just like a shelving wall that separated the living room from the kitchen, so you could see through either room. And I just have this vivid memory of my father throwing liquor glasses and my mom dodging them, and I can hear them shattering on the cabinets. And I've realized through recovery, sometimes we have memories and we're not sure if there was something that actually took place, or maybe this is something that we felt took place. And I remember sharing that with my oldest sister. She's 9 years my senior. Maybe you could edit that out if she hears this. But I remember sharing that with her and saying, "Hey, can you shed some insight here? This is what I remember as my very first memory. I can't think of anything before this that ever happened in my life." I would have been about 4.5 years old. And she said, "This absolutely took place." It was a little bit before that, where my father had gotten, he was sort of on the edge of getting caught for doing some money stuff at work. And so he took off with my oldest sister down to Florida, without the knowledge of my mother or any of us knowing. And so he had no intention, from what we learned, of ever returning. What happened was he had a brother down there and his brother's wife. And while he was starting to work and try to build a whole new life down there with my oldest sister, he would say things like, "Hey," he would drop her off at their house and say things like, "Hey, make sure she doesn't call her mom," and things like that. And so our aunt sort of had an intuition about that and ended up calling home, and of course revealing, hey, what was really taking place, and got her on a plane, got her home. Well, the end of that story is, after a little while of being back home and all these sort of things, the school year had taken place. So my oldest 2 sisters were at school. My father never returned, as far as anyone knew, from Florida. We're sort of moving on with life. My mom's working at a bank. I'm the youngest, so I'm with a nanny next door from our house. Well, what happens is my father returns from Florida, doesn't tell anyone, picks me up from the nanny, says, "Don't tell anybody. Just, he's my son. I want to spend time with my son." Of course, she calls my mom. My mom comes home immediately, fearing he's going to do the same thing. I mean, really, call it what it is. It's a kidnap,
Right.
That's really what we were experiencing. That's what he was attempting to do with me. My mom intersected that, and there's that physical altercation with the liquor glasses.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so this was my very first memory that I ever had. Still, I haven't remembered anything that happened before this. And so that was really a pattern of what took place for, really close to 4 years of my life. And I'm sure before that, things I don't remember. But that was really the pattern that started just this search for, why does nobody love me? Why does nobody want me? Why do I have this pain and this rejection? Why am I scared of everyone and everything? And those were sort of the things that really, the feelings and emotions and experiences that really fueled me. Ultimately, when I had that first sip, or I guess at that point, the second sip of alcohol when I was a teenager, that just took me on a search for trying to feel whole and using all the wrong things and all the wrong people. And, that led me in a cycle of addiction that took place for 15 years of my life.
So Tony, I want you to pick up with this story and unpack that for us. But I want to back up just to ask a couple clarifying questions. So if I understood correctly, it was your 7th birthday where your dad gave you a cigarette and beer, and then it was a year later was the last time that you saw him. And what was it after he's throwing these shot glasses at your mom that you didn't see him again? Or
Right.
and And then when did you learn that he actually was had embraced like a gay identity or was living in a homosexual relationship?
Yeah, thank you. So the shot glass or the liquor glass physical altercation took place just before my parents, as they were in the process of divorcing. I'd have been about between 4 and 5 years old.
Oh, that's right. You said that. Yeah. Okay.
My 7th birthday is when my father gave me. They had gotten a divorce after that, and my father got custody of myself and my 2 older sisters for financial reasons. So we were living with him at that time. So by the time my 7th birthday rolled around, we were still living with him. This was also when I got sent home from school for the jewelry and all these sort of things. And I got the beer, the cigarette, but my father never stopped stealing and embezzling and doing all the things to fuel his lifestyles and his parties and all these sort of things. So that caught back up to him. And what he did before he took off was he sort of was trying to figure out, I guess, whether he was going to take off or not. His partner that we found out later that he was living within a homosexual lifestyle with this partner. This guy lived in Delaware, so there would be trips that my father would take. And just after he had got caught and he could sort of feel the embers starting to burn on him with the law, he had taken off from our house where we lived with him, by the way. I mean, we're 3 minor kids living with him, and he runs. Yep. And he, in the fleeing towards his partner's house, he attempted suicide. He had slit his wrists. He'd slit his throat. He was almost basically left for dead in a cornfield headed towards Delaware, where he was heading to his partner's house. It was actually my oldest sister who found him in that car, in that situation. She just had a sense because she knew he was always taking trips to this friend's. As far as we knew, this was a friend. At that time, that's what we knew. So she had an intuition about that. And so she ended up finding him in that situation, getting him in the hospital. Coming out of that, I think he was wrestling with, do I face the music and sort of, do what I need to do? But he ultimately made the decision shortly after that, as court dates were approaching. He saw us one time as kids and really sold us on, I'm going to do the right thing. I would never hurt you guys. I love you guys. I care about all these things that, I look back now with empathy, but I know he was just lying and reaching and really trying to heal his own wounds, that he just wasn't capable of doing. But he had this big, I'm sorry, and I'm going to straighten up, and I want you guys back in my life. And that was the last time I've ever heard from him. We met in a mall food court. I remember the table. I remember exactly where it was. I remember the door he walked through. I remember my mother picking us up, going home. I remember being so confused. I was 8 years old at this time, especially a son, the only son with your dad. There's so much there within that relationship. But that'd be the last time I ever saw him, heard him, got anything I never got any cards or nothing. It's the last I've ever heard of him until just a few years ago, right before Christmas, hearing of his passing.
Wow, that's tragic. I mean, that's, And how old are you now, Tony?
So I am 36 now.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, so pick up the story and talk about kind of what this, you talked about the second sip of beer and just how that had really a massive impact on opening up this whole other world. But talk about your teen years and moving into adulthood.
Sure. So, at that time, my mother, shortly after this, had begun dating a man. And, he's my stepdad. I call him dad now as a grown man. We've got an incredible relationship now, and we have for a very long time. But those teen years and adolescent years were really rough. I sort of adopted, you got to know I'm coming out of this strange few years with my own father, where it's like you get anything you want. There's no boundaries. It's a very strange lifestyle. Sometimes there's massive parties going on in our house, just all these wild experiences. And then I move into almost the exact opposite situation where there's structure and there's bedtime and there's chores and there's all the things. And, being a young kid trying to process this, there was just instant resentment and walls that went straight up. A lot of the attitude that I adopted was, "You're not my dad," these sort of things. And it took a while for me to sort of adjust into that whole different lifestyle, whole different boundaries and rules and all the things. So there was that was taking place as an adolescent heading into my teen years. I also really struggled academically at that time. My elementary years, I'd moved around so much. I was in so many different elementary schools, all picking up curriculum in different areas. Actually, as a third grader, I remember sort of picking up on the fact and telling my mother, "Hey, I think I'm not sure, but I think I'm in a special needs class at school." And it come to reveal, I actually was. I couldn't read. I couldn't tell time. I struggled with a lot of things in school. So there was that wrestling too. Not only am I dealing with the pressure of my environment and this major adjustment, now at school I'm wrestling with, I don't think I belong here, but man, maybe I do. Like, am I this? Am I that? I had.
And that's interesting, Tony. I don't think I've ever shared this before, but because it was a kind of a brief stint. I mean, I've shared plenty of times that I bounced around from public school to Christian school, then to public school again, then to homeschooling. But I think when I went back to public school the second time, I was put into some kind of special needs class as well. Like they put me in for English into this class where I don't know if the students were dyslexic. I mean, that may have been part of it, but they just had a really hard time learning. And I just felt so stupid. I felt like, man, there must be really something wrong with me. And then at the same time, I felt like, well, I'm understanding. Like, I don't know why I'm in this class. And I was answering questions, but I was in that class for, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks. And then finally the teacher gave me a note and said, "You don't need to be in this class. You need to move to this other." It certainly wasn't an honors class or anything, but that feeling of, no, there really is something wrong with me. And even if I'm getting out of this class, like, I'm probably barely getting out of this class because I'm so stupid. And so I don't know. It sounds like we kind of had a similar experience in that.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, really, I just remember at that time in my life just feeling so worthless and inadequate. I just felt like I couldn't find my place. I couldn't find my rhythm. I didn't know where I belonged. I definitely had no clue who I was as a young man. But what ended up happening was, because of all those feelings, so, being in this rule, boundary bound environment, being in academically involved with school where I felt like I needed to prove myself, I sort of chameleoned my environment. And I realized, okay, if I can just focus on excelling at things like academics and things like sports, this solves all my problems. At home, I follow the rules. I excel. The more I excel in school and in sports, I've got some acceptance there. There's really nobody on my back. My stepdad was very strict when I was growing up. So, but the more I seem to sort of accumulate some accolade, it's not that I got less strict. It just sort of, it wasn't as apparent. I didn't get the full blown treatment of, questions and this and that. There was a trust that was being built, in the way he was wired. And I think it's important to note, at the time, he never had any of his own biological kids. So really, and this was a basis for how we regrew our relationship. There was a lot of empathy there, because really he did his best. He never did anything wrong. He was a great dad for the tools that he was equipped with, but it was a very strict environment. And I learned that if I excel in these different areas, it feels like acceptance starts to come. I don't feel that rejection in the way I do anymore, certainly at home, and then absolutely in school. If you're doing well academically, which I ended up, in high school, I went from, of course, that experience in elementary school and not knowing how to read and wrestling with that. That was I really was driven to overcome that quickly as a young kid. And I really fell in love with academics. I mean, I love learning. I loved all that. And by the time I got to high school, I was in all the honors. I was in advanced placement and getting college credit at, midway through high school, and all these sort of things. I also played basketball and excelled in sports. So, in school, it felt like, man, everybody loves me here. My teachers love me. My friends love me. My peers love me. Administration loves me, all these sort of things. And, so that's what I was seeking, though.
Well, that's a big turnaround. That definitely didn't happen with me. My crappy school experience kind of lasted throughout high school. So
yeah. I think I was I think I always had a love for that. Sort of what those things ignited was a love for learning. And, also sort of in the mix of this high school adolescent age, my mother had started to take us to church. So in the mix of there, I was 12 years old. I remember we were going to a little independent Baptist church. At this point, we're living just outside of Annapolis, Maryland. And there's an old hymn that came on. So for several weeks, maybe months, I had just sat when they told me to sit. I stood up when they told me to stand up. I closed my eyes when they told me to close my eyes. And I just sort of listened the best I could and really had no idea what was really going on. There was an old hymn that came on that we all sang called "Victory in Jesus," and I'm sure you and many know that. Yes. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And I'm 12 years old. I'm hearing this hymn. I've at that point heard a ton of hymns, but for whatever reason, God used that one to sort of pierce my heart. I remember thinking and sharing even at that time, I didn't know victory existed. As a 12-year-old, all I felt was defeat in every experience of my life. I didn't even know victory was possible. I didn't even know what that looked like. I didn't know what that sounded like. The idea that I could have victory through Jesus and in Jesus just completely opened a door for spirituality and for salvation and for God's grace and mercy to sort of begin to have some roots in my life and in my heart as a young kid. So I got saved and baptized when I was 12. And so part of this heading into high school journey with sports and academics was also a desire to want to know something transcendent. I wanted to know what was out there. I want to know who was God. And so I got into things like, I was into the church. I was into reading the Bible. I also read a lot of philosophy and all sorts of things. I just had a desire to want to know where truth is and where that lies and who is God and what is transcendent. What are all these things? So it kind of took me on that journey. I describe that maybe 12 to 17, 18 range as I didn't grow up in the church, but I grew up around the church. So I was, saved. I was baptized. I believe that was a genuine part of my Christian following Jesus experience. But I was also lacking good mentors at the time. I had a big trust issue with men in my life. I didn't trust. You really had to. You weren't going to earn my trust. It was very hard to earn my trust as sort of a mentor, a man in a mentor role or a role model or things like that. I didn't really look up to people easily. I kind of felt like I was on this solo journey to try to figure out all these things. And there were times trickled in there.
What did that look like for you, Tony, in terms of how did you respond to men and were you just kind of quiet and withdrawn around them, or were you more obviously just kind of put off and maybe in some way rebellious? How did you kind of present in your lack of trust?
So I think it was a mixed bag for me, because there were times in early adolescence heading into my teen years where I did give some rope for some trust to be built. And often I would begin to have a good trusting relationship that was starting with, say, coaches or a youth group leader or something like that. But it always seemed to be the case that then this man would exit my life. And it wasn't,
Yep.
Looking back, I go, none of it was ever for a bad reason. Maybe they just moved their job. I had a youth minister, and that was the case. Him and his wife were amazing. They were a big part of my life. And then they just moved. And then now all the same feelings come back. Like, man, as a kid, that's just what happened to me. That's just that was my experience. I just felt like, man, they are, it was so self-centered in my thinking, because that was just my experience and what I was capable of at the time. So it just made me feel, again, rejected and sort of isolated. So I felt like I'd put these efforts in. I'd sort of get somewhere with a coach or a pastor or something like that. And then in some way there would be something that I perceived as a misstep, or maybe they would leave, or something that would make me questionable. And then there was no like, hey, let me try to process this in a healthy way. I didn't have the equipment to do that. It was just instantly, okay, I can't trust you. And so, that was sort of my experience in that age. And that really carried over, into my teens and into my 20s, where I was just always very able to give people chances, but very quick to withdraw trust. It didn't take much. It took a lot to earn it, and it didn't take very much to lose it.
Yeah, understandably.
Yeah. So then what ended up happening was at the end of my teenage and high school years, I'd actually gotten hurt, and I didn't have a good reason. I wasn't going to be able to play sports my senior year of high school. And so I didn't have a lot of good reasons at that time otherwise to stay in. So I actually ended up graduating high school early. So I graduated when I was 17, as a junior. And for me, that looked like I can finally move out on my own and get some freedom out from under these boundaries and rules, and really start to be my own man, and, all these things. And it didn't take very long for that to quickly turn into getting involved in all the wrong lifestyles. That's when, when I was 17 and starting to move out on my own in apartments with friends and things like that, then I really started to develop a deep foundation for a double life that I would live up until I came to Frederick in 2019. I sort of had this front that I put on for people that were close to me, that I loved, my family, or maybe even a girlfriend at the time, certainly my wife, and when we were engaged and when we were dating. There was one Tony that I wanted those people to know. And then there was this other Tony that developed between my being 17 up through my 20s, where I was involved with partying and drugs and alcohol. And I had got involved in a lot of criminal lifestyle myself. I began to sell drugs. That was a big part of my life. Doing crime in that sort of arena. It was
well. And for those listening, Tony, and or watching this, I just want to pause for a moment and just ask our viewers, listeners, to consider, like, where was the origin? I mean, you talked about kind of the origin of your first introduction into either alcohol or drugs, that kind of thing. And that is an important question. And it's also an important question: when were you first exposed to pornography? And what did that kind of begin and kind of unfold in someone's life? But the other thing I would just ask, based on what you're sharing right now, and I also lived a double life as well, but I think it's important to go back and begin to, be prayerful about it, and not overly fixated on it, but begin to ponder, where did I first begin to start living a double life? Because so many people aren't even thinking about that literally that's what they've been doing. A double life, a triple life, whatever. They're grabbing one mask and putting it on. Sometimes that starts at 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. And other times it might begin as for a teenager. But it's just critical that we begin to ask that question and consider, where did that first begin? Where did that start to, kind of unravel and unfold for us? And so I just would encourage people to consider that, as part of kind of looking back and beginning to understand, oh, this is, it's unhealthy actually for a person to live a double life and to live in kind of two worlds. We're meant to live an integrated life, and where we're known both in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly. But so often we don't do that. We compartmentalize all those things. So I think that's a really critical part of your story.
Yeah, and even as you're saying that, I'm thinking it became apparent to me that a very apparent double life began when I was 17 and 18 and starting to get involved in these whole other scenes. But really the seeds were being sown in my adolescence, sort of putting on one mask at home to sort of appease and gain some acceptance in how I behaved there. And then sort of putting on a different school mask. And, so the seeds were really sown very early for me to be able to do that.
Right.
And sort of also within that, I look back and I go, there's this whole manipulating thing that's taking place where I'm really learning. I often tell people when I'm sharing my story, especially in recovery circles and church circles, I hold a PhD in manipulation. And I gained that as a young child. Those experiences I really put in the years to get that. It's nothing I'm proud of, but it's a part of my story. It was very easy. It was easy for me to sort of learn people because I felt like I had to. So that was one thing that I sort of a gift, maybe even from God, to be able to discern and understand people a little bit and how they work and sort of what ticks them and what doesn't and all these sort of things. And, I used it to manipulate for so many years because I just wanted to be accepted, at the end of the day.
Yep.
That's what it was. And it all came from that hurt and that pain. But yeah, really, so throughout my 20s, leading into this was this just whole double lifestyle of addiction and alcoholism and criminal lifestyle and all these sort of things. And there's all the ups and downs and roller coasters that come with that. I'd been in jails. I'd been arrested several times. I'd, been in different rehab programs, outpatient and all these sort of different
And what were
things.
some of the arrests for, Tony? What were some of the what your legal issues about?
They were DUIs. They were things like getting caught in the middle of something, and one of them I think was like a false statement to police officers. I was lying to cops and getting caught for that.
But really running with the wrong crowd, obviously, and running in a way that put you in the crosshairs of the law, basically.
Yeah, and I think it's safe to say too, if I'm going to be transparent, there's one thing of running with the wrong crowd, and certainly that was the case. Also, the wrong crowd was running with me. I was sort of the guy in a lot of this. I'd really sort of gained some all the bad reputation for being a bad guy. I was being involved with selling drugs and all that kind of lifestyle. It's a whole different sort of world, and I had a reputation in that world. And so, that was also a part of just, who I was and, a lot of the interactions I had with the law and different people and all sorts of altercations and all sort of things. But also one of the things I think that's important to sort of thread in through this is my sexual identity and sexual brokenness through all this. I have this. So when I was living out this lifestyle, it did give me the means to be able to really party and do things and I never had to worry about money in a sense that, I didn't have any, and I could always sort of fund the fun, and so when you're that guy and you can fund all the fun and the parties and all that, a lot of people want to be around you. And so all throughout my 20s, there's this just woman after woman after woman. I mean, I'm just seeking this sort of, man, where can I find acceptance and love? And I look back and I think I had a lot of mixed feelings based off what I knew about my father and his experiences and his living a homosexual identity in life. a lot of my mentality as a young adult was, I don't want to be anything like my dad. I don't want to be anything like him. So, and everything I did had to be to the max. So, if he's living like this, well, I'm going to show that I'm nothing like my dad, and I'm going to get with every woman that I desire, and things like that. So it sort of took me on this whole sexual brokenness thing that was weaved throughout. And I lived for so long thinking that didn't mean much, and that didn't affect much of who I was or my spirituality, or I just the sort of lifestyle I was involved in and the people that I was around at that time, you were kind of like praised for that. This wasn't something that was like looked down on by it. And there was nobody in my camp or in my circle going, hey, you ought to reconsider this sort of thing and what it's doing to you spiritually and emotionally and mentally and physically and all those sort of things. It was really the exact opposite. It was praised, and it was, oh, you're the guy, this is awesome.
Well, and especially as a guy, right? I mean, women would not experience the same thing. No one's going around high-fiving women for sleeping with tons of men. But for some reason, from kind of a worldly dude's perspective, that's, supposedly cool or whatever. And yet just such a reflection of the brokenness you're talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, all of that was mixed into it. And, I'd gotten to a point with my addiction. Of course, there were times it was all a roller coaster. So I'd say by my mid-20s, or a little bit, maybe even earlier than that, a lot of the criminal lifestyle, the intentional criminal lifestyle, say, with selling drugs and all these sort of things, had really been put to rest. And then I'm sort of left with trying to live in the real world, so to speak. And now I've just got this drinking problem and drug problem. So that's where the double life sort of takes over in that sort of sense, where I'm trying to wrestle with my addiction, and I'm also trying to wrestle with, how do I live a normal sort of life? How can I cope with sort of the bounds of culture and, what's expected of me and all those sort of things. And in the midst of all that is when I met my wife. I was managing a restaurant. She had gone back to work. She had worked there previously. She'd gone back to work because she wanted to go back to school and get a dental hygiene degree. She had already had a very great career at the time, but she wanted to switch. And that's where we met. And, I remember looking back and just thinking, man, this is like somebody I've never met before. She had very different life experiences than me. She was, in my eyes, in my broken eyes at the time, I'm thinking, man, this is like an angel sent from God. She just had such a great upbringing, such a great family, great parents. She was just so kind and full of grace and mercy, and just had a big smile, and she was beautiful, and she's all these incredible things, and I fell for her. And it was sort of this idea of, I know my other life that I'm keeping from her and the other people I love. But I knew it was different. Like in the past, it's like, okay, if this girlfriend finds out, it's not a big deal. Like, she's just going to find out. Maybe she'll leave. Maybe she won't. It's okay. But with her, I went, man, I don't want to hurt her. I don't, this is different. This is a different kind of love. This is a different kind of feeling. But ultimately, that's exactly what happened. We dated, and after a couple of years, we got engaged in early 2017. By the end of 2017, September 2nd, we got married. And then 3 months after that, just 4 days before Christmas, I had left work one day early. At that time, of course, she already had her dental hygiene degree. She was in that world. I was managing a different restaurant at the time. I'd gotten off early. I went to go see my drug dealer. I got some pain pills. Those had been laced with fentanyl, and I flatlined. I overdosed. I flatlined, and I was sort of brought back just as I was getting out of an ambulance to head into the hospital. Within a few hours, though, I stayed for a minute, whatever the absolute minimum was in the hospital. Really, just my behavior was erratic. I should have never left there, but I did everything I could to get out of there. And I still made it back home in the time frame that I would have been off work normally. And my illness, in the peak of my addiction, or the depths rather of my addiction, I tried to walk in the house as if nothing happened.
Wow.
Having overdosed and flatlined, it was very apparent that a lot had happened. In fact, I was so out of it. I left the hospital. The wristband was on. I mean, it was very apparent that something very tragic had happened.
But you're trying to cover it up and just act like everything's normal.
Tried to cover. Yeah, that's just what you do. When you're in that position. So, but that never even had a chance. As soon as I walk in the house, this argument this whole thing. I remember that night. We were renting a townhouse at the time. She slept in another room where we had just stored some boxes because we had just moved in, and she's sleeping on the floor of this. It's not a very clean room. It was a storage landing spot for a place we just moved in. And I'm there in the bed, and just continuing to overdose all night. I just spent the night with my head in the toilet. I didn't know I was going to make it through the night. And true to my addiction, I woke up the next day, went to work at the restaurant, tried to go on with life as if no big deal. This can get figured out. It's, I'll justify it away. I'll figure out a way. She'll have empathy towards me or grace, and we'll kind of move on. But she did the hardest thing any wife could ever do. She left immediately, and then within a week or so said, "You need to get out, and you need to go get help." And it would be 327 days where we didn't have any contact. This was basically all of 2018. She did all the right things during that time. She really got even more deeply involved with our church and counseling, and she went to Nar-Anon and Al-Anon and tried to really figure out what is it like living with a loved one suffering from addiction. She did all those things, and I spent that whole 327 days really thinking and building a resentment. How could you leave somebody that you love so much? Were the thoughts and feelings I had towards her. And so within 4 months or so of that, having not heard from her at all, I was renting a room in another place. And, the thought crossed my mind, well, I'm just going to get divorce papers at some point in the mail. So I needed a backup plan. I convinced myself I needed a backup plan. So, I began to see another woman. We started dating. So here I am, just broken in so many ways, and showing it in every way. I'm broken in my addiction. I'm broken in my identity. I'm broken sexually. Here I am in the midst of adultery now, just all these things. And it'd be November of that year where my wife was reading the passage where Jesus calls his disciples who'd been out all night fishing and not catching anything to cast their net one more time. And of course, in the story, they bring in so many fish they can't even haul the net in. She had the exact opposite experience. She cast her net, and I was worse than I'd ever been. And in recovery, in life,
when you say she cast her net, you mean she reached
back out. Yeah, she had reached out.
Yep.
She felt like that's what God was calling her to do.
And she's probably hoping, well, maybe reality is set in, and maybe you've made some positive steps forward or something.
I would think logically that's what she was thinking. But having talked with her many times about this, really, when she did it boldly, because in her mind it was, let me confirm that he hadn't done any of that so I can move on.
Okay.
So that's where she was coming from. And but for whatever reason, and her and I were just talking about this. We uncover this every once in a while and try to talk about it. And she said we neither one of us can figure out how we ended up back together. other than God just made that one flesh that not even man can separate. I couldn't do it. She couldn't do it. My sin, my broken, all the things, adultery couldn't do it. But anyway, she had reached out. She'd cast her net. It was way worse than it ever been. But from my perspective, in recovery, in your addiction, I would say in sin recovery, whatever your sin is, you've got to hit a bottom.
Yeah, that's right.
You got to hit a bottom. You got to hit a point where you realize this is affecting me and everybody close to me that I love. And it was in that whole reaching back out where I realized truly how much my decisions and my problems had affected my wife. She had gotten to a point where she didn't even want to live anymore. And so what I had was an emotional bottom. I had had jail bottoms. I'd had overdose and flatline. I mean, those are things you go, well, it's about that'll make him turn his life around. It was none of those things. What caused me my eyes to open and have this moment of clarity was realizing that I had gotten to what I was doing, how I was living, affected my wife, the person that I truly did love but didn't know how to love, to a point where she didn't even want to be here anymore. And that opened my eyes, and I said, well, I've at least got to do something so she can go on. And that was sort of my motivating factor of getting in to a recovery program. And that's what brought me to Frederick, January 21st of 2019. There's a Change Life Recovery program in the local Frederick Rescue Mission here. And just to tell you a quick thing about how I sort of got propelled by my faith in that program. I walked in and I wasn't even sure yet that I was going to stay. It's a year-long program at the time. All the reasons to leave are bouncing around in my head. But so the first 30 days there, you're in a blackout period. You're not supposed to make any calls to people. The only thing you can do is write letters, and that's for all good reason. And so the very first day, when I get brought in the program, it's middle of the day. It's about 1 p.m. and I'm sitting on my bed. It's a dormitory style. So there's other beds, but all the other men are in their various work areas for the day. So I'm by myself. And I remember sitting on the edge of the bed, and I had probably one of the most genuine prayers I'd ever prayed. It's important that, throughout my addiction, throughout all this, all the bad stuff, I still prayed every single night. There was always a belief in God that sort of resonated with me that I held on to. I just tell people I didn't have faith. I had a whole lot of belief. I didn't have any faith. But I had a real genuine belief, faith prayer sitting on that bed at 1 p.m. that first day. And I just genuinely sort of poured out and said, God, I don't know how I got here, and I don't know what to do. Help me. And when I said amen, it felt like somebody wrapped their arms around me. It's something I can't really explain other than that, but I had this sort of sense. And I wrote about that in a letter to my oldest sister. Her husband had dropped me off at the program. And so I wrote in that letter, maybe the next day or two, hey, this is the experience I had after praying, and I don't know what any of this means, but I'm going to give it a little bit of time and see what happens. So after the 30 days is up and I can make calls, she's one of the first calls I make. I wasn't calling my wife at the time. When I got into the program, she told me, you can graduate the whole program and we might start over as friends. That's where she left it. Don't call me. And I sort of in a last ditch effort, I said, can I write letters to you? And she said, yes. And we both know the only reason she said yes is because I hadn't done anything I said I was ever going to do at that point. So right. I think she's sort of like, yeah, sure. If you want to write a letter, write a letter. But I wrote a letter to my sister, and I shared with her about that experience. And I call her after the 30 days, and I'm feeling physically, spiritually, emotionally. I'm starting to feel a lot better after those first 30 days. And I'm excited, and I'm explaining all that to her. And she goes, hey, I got to tell you something. When you pulled out of the driveway, her and my niece prayed for me. And the exact prayer they said was that when I got there, that God would wrap his arms around me and never let go.
Mhm.
And that was sort of all I needed to. I tell you, I lived with a lot of belief, but I didn't have any faith. And that gave me
Yeah.
the faith to start taking some actions and surrender and go, okay, Lord, you've got this. I don't. I've got every evidence of how I don't have this. And I'm just
Yeah.
going to surrender and see what you can do and how you can change things for me. And it would also be throughout that program that I was writing letters to my wife, and we reconciled really through letters, which is incredible. I sort of look back and go, well, that makes a lot of sense as a pastor as I think through it, because the New Testament, funny enough, is a collection of God using letters to reveal and to reconcile and to redeem. And so it's not a foreign concept to our God that he uses letters in a powerful way to redeem and reconcile and reveal who he is and what he can do.
Yes. Wow. Such a powerful story, Tony. I'm so grateful for you being here and just sharing this with us. And it's, you're a pastor today, and people hearing this story might feel like, oh my gosh, I mean, how could he go on to be a pastor or whatever? And I feel like, when genuine repentance occurs, and when there's real progress forward, and there's a willingness to be open and vulnerable and transparent with these things, like, who better than to be a pastor than someone who's gone through, this kind of stuff. And so I really want to pick up the story a little bit in terms of how God led you into even, like, where did this even dawn on you that you might be a pastor, or that ministry would be something that could be open to you? And so there's a lot that God's done in your life over the last 6 years. I mean, it's not been a very long time in some ways, and yet it's been long enough to prove out that something powerful and genuine and growing has happened in your life, and the fruit of that is evident. So anyway, I'd love to pick up the story, and we're going to do a part 2 of this. But for those of you who have been watching, listening to this really testimony and story of God's grace and mercy and work in Tony's life, I hope that this has been encouraging to you, and again, also challenging to you. I hope that you'll tune in next week to pick up part 2 of maybe a tiny bit more of his story, but also really about how God has been putting ministry and broken people on Tony's heart, and what the Lord has been leading in Tony's life, his wife's life, on how to minister to some really broken people here or there on the East Coast. And so, Tony, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. We're so grateful.
Thank you for having me. It's been an honor.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us for the Love and Truth Network podcast. We hope that the stories and insights shared have ignited in you a sense of God's powerful love for you, and given you encouragement for your own journey toward relational and sexual wholeness. Remember, transformation is absolutely possible when rooted in grace, truth, and authentic biblical community. Subscribe today, share with a friend, share with your pastor, and we look forward to seeing you in our next Love and Truth Network podcast.